I'm going to open up this topic in general, though, today. The sexual relationship does not exist. And I'm going to sketch out some aspects of this, primarily through the work of Lacan and the work of some artists, including David Lynch. I mentioned in the description the somewhat challenging or ironic concept that psychoanalysis and modern art are mystery schools. These are our modern mystery schools. And the mystery schools were part of all traditions, esoteric, Taoism, Buddhism, the Vedas, the Greeks, Eleusis. There are many. We could consider these our mystery schools. And so in addition, although perhaps less, I will be talking about Jung, who obviously rediscovered psychoanalysis as related to the mystery schools and began to relate it to ancient alchemy and Gnosticism and Rosicrucianism, as well as the Eastern mystery schools. Now, Lacan may be considered less esoteric in that sense. And although he encoded it more and more in his late work, he does refer to Christian mysticism and the post-medieval era as essential to how he's learning to resolve the sexual relationship and the Oedipus complex. So we can say that Freud introduced the dilemmas and impasses of the sexual relationship and the Oedipus complex for the first time in a clearly articulated way, but that Lacan resolved it. And I'm going to lead us through some of the later aspects of how Lacan did that and how Jung approached it. But at the same time, I won't be able to do it in detail completely. Some of the final solutions that he developed, I'm going to reveal in detail in the seminar that I'll be doing on Lacan at Analytica. So if you're very interested in that, I will show what I've added to Lacan's diagram and some of the things that he developed in his late work that haven't really been made public. So what is this? The sexual relationship does not exist. Lacan's phrase was "la rapport sexuel n'existe pas." This is Lacan's famous diagram of the sexual relationship. The phrase "la rapport sexuel n'existe pas" can be read many ways. This was a technique of Lacan's, theoretically and analytically, to use poetics and punning and other techniques to try to crack through the programming of language. So when he says that, he means many things. Does he mean the sexual relationship does not exist? To a certain degree, yes. This is the title that I chose to highlight and to relate it to the current state of affairs in the world. Meaning it appears that we've reached this peak level of divorce and the impossibility of the sexual relationship as we have known it historically. If you look broadly through history, you'll see that perhaps relationships were performed for cultural and economic and political reasons throughout history. The idea that desire and love was the basis of a relationship at all, let alone one that would become conjugal, is a very recent and rare phenomenon. There are some books tracing this idea as an esoteric method that goes back to esoteric Christianity. Essentially, the troubadour poets and the knights of the Round Table, for whom the woman was a kind of sublime reference to the divine and a muse that allowed for creation and the pursuit of a journey of evolution. I'm going to talk about this later and return to this as a solution that Jung and Lacan pose in different ways, or variations on this solution to the current state of the sexual relationship as impasse. But if you could also interpret the rapport, the sexual rapport. What does this mean, rapport? Something like a resonance, being attuned. No, the rapport doesn't exist because there is noise in communication theory, noise that gets in the way, like all of the noise of the technology that we're trying to use today that's getting in the way of my message of transmission. from my subjective truth to your subjective experience. It's useful to work with this. And as I've said before, psychoanalysis can be considered working with noise and communication theory to a great extent. Lacan's earliest seminars, he made a lot of connections there between communication theory and cybernetics and psychoanalysis in the 50s. And it's still relevant today. Working through noise could be considered an analytic method and technique. My psychic reality and your psychic reality are different. And the noise makes us aware of that. It frustrates us because it breaks us out of our delusion that we're sharing the same ideal or fantasy. In any case, a third meaning of the sexual rapport does not exist is that man and woman are not complementary, like yin and yang. They do not balance. It is not simply a matter of balancing. There's a disjunction which forever remains imbalanced. So it's a matter of finding a balance of imbalance or accepting an imbalance of balances. And this is already present in this diagram. So what does this answer to our cultural moment? Again, perhaps this is something we can return to in the questions. If people have comments and questions about the state of the world and relationships today, the Me Too movement that recently arose, intensifications of gender identity issues, the increasing divorce rate, the lack of interest in ongoing relationships, more and more pursuit through sexual technology like Tinder to find relationships. All of these things have arisen only in the last few years and have seemed to be radically pushing this question to the forefront. Even astrologically, I have been told that there are astrological movements, the outer esoteric planets like Pluto that refer to the more spiritual, esoteric, karmic dimensions of our being, going through major transitions and retrogrades, causing all relationships that have survived on a kind of past ideal or repeated method of orthodoxy to be broken. So perhaps it's not a bad thing. Can we learn something from some of these figures in psychoanalysis and art about where to go with this? That's what I'm interested in, broadening the scope of psychoanalysis. And for these figures, at least these four figures, psychoanalysis was not just a technique, a better form of therapy within the medical or psychiatric field. It certainly was that, but it was ultimately something more. Why it can be considered a mystery school or esoteric is that they all aimed for it to become a way of life, something that would change not just medicine and healing and therapy, but also education and government, as Freud said, of the three impossible professions, something which would become a new social relation amongst humans. And that could perhaps give us an answer to this impasse. So what's in this diagram here? Well, there's two aspects to it, the upper and the lower, first of all. And Lacan turned to logic and mathematics to try to make psychoanalysis more rigorous at the end of his life, seeing that empirical science or laboratory science wasn't really the most appropriate. So here's two examples, the top being a form of logic, a kind of algebraic method, the bottom being a diagrammatic method that bears some resemblance to model theory and or category theory, the most abstract forms of mathematics that have been developed in recent times. If you take the top first and say, what does this mean? When I said that the two sides were incommensurable, well, first of all, there's a movement in Lacan away from Freud, from male, female to masculine, feminine, finally to binary logic, non-binary logic. So we can begin with the question of biological sex, move to the question of object choice and desire and identity, which becomes constructed by the other, for the other, in relation to the subject during childhood and upbringing. We could think of sex that precedes that as something biological, perhaps a biological fact, perhaps a spiritual or karmic fact. But object, desire, and choice, and gender identity and construction are things that Freud showed are created from birth onwards and are malleable. Finally, though, Lacan takes it to a place where we no longer even have to speak about it in terms of the sexes. While Jung developed the idea that every female has both a feminine and masculine aspect, an anima and animus, and every male has a masculine and feminine aspect, anima and animus, which goes a long way to being able to separate the two things. And for Jung, it was part of the alchemical process he discovered in the ancients that was also part of psychoanalysis in trying to understand and develop the so-called opposite by means of staging with the other. So for Jung, and what I consider his greatest text is the Psychology of the Transference. He shows how the psychology of the transference in childhood and in the psychoanalytic process and in the alchemical process, which included actual physical creations, artistic creations and diagramming, and as well actual metallic and herbal medicines, was part of the great art of working with these balances. And so he parallels the three levels. Lacan, in his own way, tries to show that as well. For example, in the upper diagram, on the left is the masculine male side. The right is the feminine female side. So essentially, this could be read as on the left, on the masculine, for all X, they're submitted to the phallic function, meaning that all is a universal in logic. And the phi represents the phallic as a function that Lacan is creating a category coming from the psychoanalytic approach. What does it mean? It means that the masculine accepts the phallic logic, that there will be a phallic or non-phallic, and that there exists in the above part of the diagram at least one that is not submitted to the phallic function. So there is an index, there is a singular, and the rest are related to that. This is a form of Aristotelian or binary logic that you could say goes back to a contingent construction, not necessarily an eternal truth. The pre-Socratics, the ancients of the East, had a different form of logos or logic, a poiesis, where to state was to be or to create. But in the beginning of a kind of binary, discrete logic developed by Plato, Aristotle, something else was created that we take for granted. It's a very useful logic. This is a logic that Lacan associates with the masculine and is on the left side. The right side repeats the same, except that the two first aspects are also barred or turned into a not, N-O-T, meaning not all on the feminine side are submitted to the phallic function, meaning women don't even operate by this exclusionary logic from the beginning. And conversely, because of this, there does not exist one that is universal or submitted to that logic. So what we have here are two different forms of logic. And there are other texts, places where you can see that the form of binary exclusionary logic associated with the masculine has dominated our culture for centuries, and that there is a continuing mathematical development of a non-binary logic that remains in the obscured position, the rejected position. So the cultural aspect of the place of the feminine or the female seems to parallel this logic as well. And so at some point, again, like I said, we can talk about things as logic, or talk about how any subject could operate a masculine and feminine logic, so to speak. So what is the meaning of the diagram, which is perhaps more interesting? Because in a sense, the diagram itself is a form of non-binary logic. And these forms of complexity theory, chaos theory, things that were developed to deal with quantum physics, fractal theory, mathematical category theory, and modeling theory all emerged in the 20th century at the impasse of exclusionary logic and the so-called masculine principle, if you want to put it that way. So in some ways, there's another aspect of the diagram where the whole top as a way of portraying is a logical masculine way of portraying something algebraically, whereas the more feminine diagrammatic aspect, which is continuous and not discrete, is presented in the lower diagram. You lose precision, but you gain complexity and subtlety. That's why ultimately for larger logicians or semioticians like Peirce, it is about being able to translate back and forth between the discrete and the continuous. That would be something like a rapport between the masculine and feminine, a rapport where there supposedly is no rapport. Perhaps that solution is why people like Lacan were doing crazy things like studying logic and math to try to understand human relationships and sexuality. So, what's in the diagram? Well, rather than just narrate the usual story about the diagram, I like to construct for myself what I think is going on and try to make new insights or new logics of it. So in working with this diagram of Lacan's and his glosses on it, it started to occur to me that there were some other symmetries and aspects to it. For example, in my version, I realign these letters slightly differently so you can see the symmetry and non-symmetry of it. But essentially, there are two variables on each side that occupy a similar place. There, on the masculine side, there is a subject and an object. On the feminine side, there is a subject and an object. On the masculine side, the subject is crossed out. The S or the bar line through it is the experience of subjectivity as being not complete. On the masculine side, as object or being objectified by the feminine or the other is the phallus, that is being seen to occupy the phallic index of a certain truth. This already gives us some insights into the kind of sexual crisis that we've been in and why Lacan tries to detach the function of the masculine or the father or the phallus from its actual reality. In other words, we're reacting to the insufficiencies of the phallic, while at the same time, the necessities are present. How is it that we preserve the necessities of this function while not confusing it? We can't throw out the phallic function along with certain versions of it in hierarchical or patriarchal form without finding some other solution to it, is the issue that we're dealing with. So if you go to the other side of the diagram, the feminine realm or dimension, so to speak, what parallels the barred S subject on the left for the masculine is the barred law, LA, which is meant to be the law, the woman. La femme does not exist. So this image of the woman that people have or men have, but women also in the discourse of society, also does not exist, since there is no universal category meant to show that each woman is a woman of singularity and difference. And that will come up later on as important. But what's not talked about ever in Lacan or by Lacanians is the parallel between the S bar on one side and the La bar on the other as slightly different versions of the same subjectivity. And you can see that diagrammatically, the line from that to something else is a functor, a function. It's called a morphism, an arrow in category theory. It leads to a function and to another element. What is this function? The function of how the woman as barred subject relates to the phallic on the other side as function. The process by which the masculine subject on the left relates to the function of the small a, the object A, the object other, small other, which is another name for the fantasy, is the parallel. So again, you have two parallels. The object A on the feminine side parallels or mirrors the phallus on the masculine side. We will leave out of the picture for the moment the extra element, which is the S parenthesis barred large A, which will give us some aspect of the beginning of a solution to this diagram. Okay, another way that I've learned to read this, based on Freud and Lacan's movements, is that for Freud, the question of and I'll go into this in more detail in the Lacan seminars and psychoanalytic clinical seminars, where we'll talk about Freud as well as Lacan, that Freud already ran into an impasse with the so-called feminine Oedipus complex. And it changed some of his views on the Oedipus complex at the end of his life. Same with Lacan more clearly. So another way to read this is that all subjects begin in the same place as barred subjects. You could say as little boys, so to speak, in that the child is yet undifferentiated and it relates to its mother, whether it has a female or male sex. That in the process of that child subject relating to the mother, it takes on a certain journey. And the quote standard way of this ending up is that the masculine subject would relate to his mother in a different way from the female or feminine, and that the identity that's taken on would be different too, except it doesn't necessarily work like that. And increasingly, we could say that is why the question of multiplicity and gender and sexual object desire increasingly in our society, and why it would be helpful to try to outline these functions beyond simply their conservative forms or their opposition as a hysterical revolt, either of which necessarily solves the problem. But in any case, we could say that, and this is echoed in Lacan's idea. Lacan sometimes misunderstood as a anti-feminist, when in some ways it could be considered the opposite. And that he says that the feminine position is closer to evolution, closer to getting beyond the symptom. So in a sense, you could say that the journey starts on the left and moves to the right, that the subject that remains a divided subject relating to an object, a unconscious fantasy, while at the same time upholding a phallic logic for himself and others, including a woman, remains in a lesser position, although it's the position that has dominated society for millions of years, or thousands of years, I should say. In the shift to the right side of the diagram, the feminine position came for Freud and Lacan to be seen in some ways as a higher state of evolution. This is paradoxical, considering the real or social place of women in the culture. But for Lacan, as he said, the masculine position, or the masculine jouissance or enjoyment, is sometimes what he called an idiot's jouissance. That is the jouissance of being in control, whether it's logically or economically or orgasmically through the phallus alone. The feminine side undertakes a greater level of castration, a castration of the castration itself, moving beyond, at least it has the possibility of, in the sense, going back to the upper logic, that women don't uphold from early on this experience of being castrated or not. There's a fundamental impossibility or loss already present by moving to this side of the diagram. However, to the degree that the woman pursues the phallic in another man and tries to use that phallus, which perhaps we could say the majority of women who are feminists attempt to do today, doesn't really change anything for them or for men and women. It's just a shift with the same logic to continue to occupy the place of the object, a fantasy, and or relate to the phallus in a man, is simply being on the other side of the diagram. Of course, as Lacan will present from this diagram seminar, is already part of his late work in 72, from 72 to 75, 76, 77. These 5 years is when his greatest transformation takes place. And I argue that during this time, he resolves the Oedipus complex. He's able, and the sexual non-rapport. He's able to present it very clearly, present and articulate acutely what's at stake during the seminar in this diagram. It doesn't get resolved until over the next few years. And then rereading backwards from those later years, we can start to use the same diagram and say that there's something else offered here, which is that it's more likely on the feminine side of the diagram or position that the feminine subject will give up this relating to the phallus and embodying the object fantasy. And she is closer to doing so than the masculine, who is occupying the phallus. That is, she will move her function or direction towards the other element in the diagram, which is the symbolic as barred big other. The big other, the grand outre for Lacan, was the other of meaning and symbolic structure. It bears an aspect of relation to the phallus, in the sense that the phallus is a kind of foundational index for the symbolic or the big other. So the acceptance of the absence of the phallus by the feminine at this moment is accompanied necessarily by the collapse of the symbolic order. That is, it works both ways. To the degree that someone's symbolic is shattered, their relation to the phallus may be as well. These are the beginning of experiences that Lacan described as subjective destitution, something beyond castration, to the degree that the small castration relates to there still being present something to be castrated, either having it or not having it. So the game of castration, which is the game of binary logic, requires a winner and a loser, in a sense, a master and a bunch of slaves. And so we can see how the master-slave dialectic, propped up by the index of the master or the phallus, is also echoed in the male-female, masculine-feminine relationship. But in this case, the feminine takes another level, a castration of castration itself, no longer occupying the place of the slave to the master or the castrated to the non-castrated, but seeing that the phallus itself is castrated, that it always ever was a contingent event. And so this initiates a greater level of subjective destitution, probably one that we could link back to the esoteric schools. For example, as I've talked about before, the parable of Christ going to the desert and returning, or the parable of the Buddha leaving society, the 10 ox herding pictures, the stages on the path, and experiencing the void. What is this other than the same thing? Is Lacan telling for the public at large, for every man, woman, the story, the inevitable story that must take place, that was reserved for certain figures or special mystery schools, where Christ and Buddha leave their programming? They not only leave their place in the family and reject it, they not only leave their place in the esoteric orders that they are a part of, they finally enter the void and go through this collapse of the other of meaning on all levels, at which point they're told to, it is told that they risk madness, demons, possession, etc., or death, or nihilism, but they return to the world. In the Buddha's case, it is a return with bliss-bestowing hands, and the Buddha, having completed this journey, is seen as joyful and received by the world. In the Western story of Christ, it ended up that this message was unacceptable to the symbolic, and that Jesus was destroyed because this exposure of the castration of castration, this exposure of the fundamental prop or fantasy of the phallic index of any given society or family or religion or scientific discipline is anathema to that community that depend unconsciously on that foundation. Hence madness. Modern times, people like Nietzsche in philosophy or Cantor in mathematics, many others in modernity went through the same process where they questioned and researched and contemplated their discipline to the highest point where things fell apart. At that point, it is necessary to construct something for oneself. It is the only choice. Sometimes described, as the necessity of contingency. Discovering that there are no necessities in the symbolic on any level, moral, scientific, or otherwise, that only contingency is necessary, immediately turns around on itself and means that the subject has the necessity to construct its own contingency. So this is the meaning of Buddha and Christ coming back with a message, with a practice, with a purpose, and trying to deliver it. So it matters not whether it survives, whether the Buddha survives along with his message or his message is corrupted, whether Christ dies and his message somehow survives, but that the transmission and creation is made. The subject here does not compromise. The subject finds the thing which is beyond his ego and his personality and beyond his subjectivity even. He finds the symbolic again in something in his cause. And I won't go into the details now. I will reserve the additions to the diagram that I have made based on Lacan and studying his later work. There are a couple other arrows and elements that enter into this picture to complete the diagram. In terms of symmetry, you could say there is one more element to be added to the left side so that there are three on both sides. One element that parallels and mirrors the collapse of the other, and a function that must take place to complete this. As Lacan leaves it here in Seminar 20, there is at least the opening and the necessity for the feminine subject who has experienced a crisis to be able to answer with something to that crisis. So these are some of the things that Lacan began to talk about a few years later in seminars on the symptom, the refinement of the symptom, and the poetics of analysis. In these cases, the question of the letter of literature and the image of art become essential. So we find an interesting parallel here between Lacan and Jung, in that Jung also turned to the alchemical artists, their idea of the sublimatio or the sublime, which of course Freud in a different level of meaning had already talked about, sublimation, but not the limited form of sublimation that Freud already uses as a kind of strategy or defense mechanism. Jung saw in the ancients and in psychoanalysis the possibility for a greater sublime, a greater sublimation that would take the sexual relation into another level. And that was a purely alchemical psychic process, even if it necessitated material actions in work or material constructions of medicine or of artistic materials on the outside. In other words, the external environment becomes a laboratory for the working of the internal environment, both psychically and sexually and materially and artistically. Okay. So where are we here? The symptom for Lacan in naming this new kind of symptom for him was a sublime symptom. The subliming and refining of our symptom was a solution for Lacan, but usually talked about without regard to the sexual. It is simply within our symptom. We come with a symptom to someone to help us. Usually a doctor, a teacher will tell us what to do, and this doesn't really help in the long run. In the question of analysis, Freud tried to help people figure out what they had to do for themselves by listening and entering into their universe and trying to facilitate a co-construction and a feedback. This place was refined by Lacan in many ways to this idea that contained within the symptom, well, first of all, it's not just the little symptom, it's the big symptom that's presented. The big symptom, which is a mythos or a caricature or a character trait or a singularity of the subject. As I've talked about it, what begins as a singularity that marks the subject becomes perverted into a symptom by our relation to the other, the big other, through our childhood and our life. And therefore, the possibility of rediscovering the originary trait or singularity of our cause, our purpose, our being in this life is found after and before. The before it became symptom is discovered in the analytic process and refined as symptom, alternative spelling for Lacana symptom. So this is a kind of paradox of finding the before after. He gave the example of certain artists like James Joyce, who had constructed through their work, their art, a new form of language, a new form of symbolic, a new cause, which enabled them to deal with their disconnection from the symbolic or the social, not to fall outside of it into symptomatic psychosis or subjective destitution, but to construct something through their work. And although the example is given of artists in the sense of poets and painters, it is not necessary that we think of it as that method. There is something that needs to be written, something specific. The writing of the symptom is a revelation of the fantasy as uncovering this fantasy that's operating unconsciously. So this became essential. Perhaps we could look at some artists, shift into looking at some artists for an example of this. I talked about the mystery school of the art of the modern artist, which parallels Lacan and the refinement of psychoanalysis. I mentioned the idea of, well, let us say that for Jung, this sort of Christic tradition, not Christian religion, but a Christ tradition became in the Middle Ages the pursuit of the Holy Grail, the Knights of the Round Table, the pursuit of the troubadour, poet, musicians, staging the journey of their great work, but staging their journey of the great work in relation to a female or a feminine mythos. So in this case, all of these relate to something that will become important, I think, if it's possible for me to talk about it. That is something that will resolve the social relation impasse today on a sexual and otherwise level. What is the meaning of the universal singular, this paradox? Lacan referred to it as the banal exceptional. How can something be banal and generic and also exceptional at the same time? How can something be universal and also singular? Is there a universal aspect of the trait or the singularity or the symptom for each of us? It's universal in that we each have it, but it's singular in that each one is completely different. Is it possible that we could come to embody, as I spoke of the other day, the question of, first, we must take our delusion seriously. Second, we must see the delusion as psychic reality, as Freud said, that we have, as long as we remain deluded that there is one reality and it's ours and everyone shares it, we don't go anywhere. If we accept that our psychic reality is singular and different from every other subject's perspective, at least we can begin to have some kind of communication through diversity and truth of singularity. If we then work on our psychic reality and singularity to understand what it is, to solidify it as cause, no longer compromising it to the other's truth or demand, but also realizing that it is only contingent and singular to us until we can make it known to the other. This is part of the great work that's alchemical, that Lacan is referring to in the work of modern artists, and that Jung was pointing to in the work of the great alchemists, what they call the magnum opus, or the great work he refound in the psychic processes of psychoanalysis and Lacan suggested was contained in the modern artist as well. For example, Joyce or Dali or Klossowski, all of whom were surrealists that Lacan was a colleague of, having published a poem in the early surrealist journals. Lacan was always a surrealist. And conversely, Breton, who was the sort of inspirator of the surrealists, the leader of the surrealists, was training as a doctor when he was interrupted by World War I, and decided afterwards to create surrealism in art and poetry and society. And he once defined surrealism, superrealism, or overrealism as psychic automatism. And I find it significant because Lacan refers to his only master being the psychiatrist Clérambault. In Clérambault's work, he speaks of psychic automatism as well, saying that the fragilely constructed personality of each person that takes place over many years contains it from a mass of material, a mass of drives, a mass of what he called automatisms. Should this personality structure, should this form of symbolic construction be challenged or shattered for a subject, he will become prey to the automatisms within and without. This is a form of dissolution or madness that may be responded to with a secondary attempt to shore up that chaos. That could be called psychosis. These ideas of Clérambault were taken over by Lacan. I'll go into this in the Lacan seminars, how his work in psychiatry and with Clérambault is essential to what he became. And Clérambault said, go study with this guy Freud, or go study this psychoanalysis stuff, because it's the only thing good out there. But the effects of Clérambault that Lacan introduced into psychoanalysis, and Lacan's original symptom and study of madness, and specifically feminine madness, which was the subject of his medical psychiatric doctoral thesis, The Madness of Women, before he entered psychoanalysis, paralleled Freud's symptom regarding his particular neurosis, his transference neurosis to the women in his life. And so we see a symptomatic parallel in Lacan and Freud, except that Freud's was a neurosis, a transference neurosis. And the symptom of Freud's familial transference neurosis, he turned into a great cure of psychoanalysis for the questions of the sexual non-relation and the Oedipus complex. But that's all neurosis. What Lacan started with was, in a sense, feminine psychosis. And his particular symptom and desire relating to madness, both in his psychiatric work and in his interest in surrealism, which also was obsessed with feminine madness, as we will see in a moment with Breton, puts him in, again, parallel yet opposition to Freud in an interesting way. So Breton, the post-doctor, newly formed poet and artist, is ultimately also a mystic in that he was interested in, and he corresponded with Freud, he was interested in pursuing the dream and the dream of reality. His friend Paul Eluard's phrase, "There is another life, but it is in this one," always stands out for me as a statement for the surrealist. The dream is in this world. And truly, that is what psychoanalysis should remember. It's not about the dreams that we bring back from sleep. Of course, we can start there because we've lost the dream of this world. But ultimately, we are living a dream, which, as I belatedly added to the statement for today's seminar, was something that David Lynch used to guide his work. David Lynch being the end of a lineage of surrealists for me. So I'm going to talk a bit about surrealism and its relation to sexual non-relation, and then come to a completion for the moment. Perhaps then comments, questions, discussions. So Breton, as I said, surrealism was psychic automatism, but Breton's earliest works were about a kind of free association in live state, that he would wander the streets dreaming, that he would dream awake in his writings as automatic writing, automatic drawing. All of this a free associative technique similar to Freud's in psychoanalysis. And several texts of these are devoted to the muse of the woman. I said this is important, again, for a little aside, because I've given over the years a series of case studies on great suicides, like David Foster Wallace or Mike Kelly, perhaps Robin Williams, Anthony Bourdain. As a challenge to the Lacanian community, these figures seem to be perfect examples of the identification and refinement of the symptom, of the santum. An artist who does not compromise and who invents a new language and who even finally becomes recognized and famous or rich because of it. Why are these different? Why do they commit suicide? Why are they different from Joyce and Dali and Klosowski? One thing that stuck out for me is that in addition to this work, the creation of the work in the santum, each of these figures had a particular relationship with their partner. Joyce's relationship to Nora was a kind of perverse mythos that he writes about. Dali's relationship to Gala, also a mythos that he elevates her to the place of a queen, that he constructs a castle around her, enriches. And Klosowski, whose partner is staged as a sexual favor to other men in the circulation of a general economy, a gift economy, for the purpose, a purpose among others of him not confusing her, not assigning her an ego role, not making her the woman, or even a same woman, but as he would call it, her first name, Robert, and even more so, Robert as a marker for a series of different subjects. Robert ce soir, Robert this evening, being different than Robert last evening. Is there something here in these masculine figures in their recognition of the essence of the feminine? So I'm not saying that there's a failure of the santum because there's still the elevation of the female relationship. It's not taking the same old relationship. Lacan states after the feminine seminar in 72, by 75, in talking about the santum, he says that in the old ways for many years, and you could say, let's say there's three periods. The period where a male-female relationship is a political economic one of kinship, of anti-incest, of political and economic power and consolidation, of the woman circulated as a gift and nothing else, of control. This permeates thousands of years of humanity. In more recent times, the esoteric state of the woman as a symptom for a man, everywhere from the alchemical higher version of the Holy Grail and the troubadours to everyday love life of today, there is this tension, the tension between, as Lacan says, the woman must be a symptom for a man. It works both ways. A man must have a woman to be a symptom, to hold the place of the symptom, which eventually becomes a burden for the woman and or the man. Conversely, the woman needs to be taken as a symptom by a man. Otherwise, she grows another symptom, Lacan says, takes another symptom. In other words, to go back to Freud, either being treated as a symptom meaningfully by a man, which has its own impasses, or worse, not having that, developing another symptom, hysteria or something else that is relational, acting out, or a physical displacement. So this is what Lacan says. If a woman has to be a symptom for a man, and this is no longer possible, what replaces that? The possibility of the refined santum, as Lacan says. what does it mean to have a relation among santomes? What would it be to move beyond the old sexual relation or sexual non-relation, which appears to be disintegrating at the current moment in any case? This was never answered by Lacan or anyone else. I use these case studies to try to answer the question. Is it enough that each subject relates to his or her symptom in the world? Is this enough? It appears not. It appears that the relation between sexes disappears in that case, but perhaps there's some integration of these two sides. The question of both. Is it possible that that one identifies with one's symptom? Does one have it or does one be it? And is it possible that one must have a santome and be a santome at the same time? In other words, that would mean that in the case of Joyce, for example, that he both constructs his santome of his work, his art, but also treats his relationship with his partner as santome, meaning she's not just an extra thing, she becomes elevated as well and recognized in her singular nature. And finally, does this even mean that it must necessarily work both ways for the man and the woman? And this is perhaps even more secret missing part of the puzzle. Is it necessary for women to desire for the first time? Is it necessary for a woman to recognize a man in his true santomatic nature, to have a passion and a mythos and a love for what he is, including his symptoms and his symptomatic nature? Has a woman ever been able to desire and love in that fashion? There are a few examples of that, which we may or may not get to today, but in the work of, for example, Joni Mitchell, in the work of Marguerite Duras, in the work of Kathy Acker, we see this turn of events, this place where these figures detach themselves from the diagram presented by Lacan, no longer embodying the usual position of woman, going through subjection destitution, writing their own symptoms through their work, poetry, music, etc. Finally, also being able to desire men, a man, in a different way. Somewhere, somehow, these two sides must be brought together in a new kind of complementarity that is non-complementarity. I believe that this would answer somewhat Lacan's question of what would the relation between santomes or symptoms be. Finally, Breton's Nadja, Mad Love, and other texts refer to a delirium where he follows the essence of the feminine, a mysterious figure, an actual woman, plays out a role for his own internal psyche. Finally, Breton says what it is that he's looking for. He's looking for, ultimately, not the woman as object to be denigrated or elevated, but her vision of the world. He seeks her vision of the world. What does this mean? He seeks to experience through her inner subjectivity. Is this a possible solution that we could seek through each other as subjects, whether man or woman, whether man and woman, or man and man, or woman and woman on the outside, subject to subject? What does this look like? It's echoed, this seeing through the vision of the singularity of the woman, this universal singular and banal exceptional, seems to appear again in the work of David Lynch. This reminded me, this phrase that that Breton affects, seeing her vision of the world, how she saw it, is something that the spirit being Bob in the Twin Peaks series says about Laura Palmer. In David Lynch's work, non-corporal entities or spirits or demons come in and out of human incorporated embodied beings, so that Bob enters the father, Leland Palmer, in order to experience sex with Laura, Leland's daughter. But also, Bob enters Laura herself as he says in one of the episodes, I want to see through your eyes. I want to taste through your mouth. So something about the sexual act is introducing this subjective spiritual experience of some kind of nature. However, it's ultimately Inland Empire that I wanted to comment on as the final capstone of Lynch's whole career. I won't have time to go thoroughly into the whole of David Lynch's work, but no other artist deals with this question of the sexual non-relationship, it appears to me, as well as David Lynch, who constantly reminds me in his work either of Lacan's ideas or of Jung's ideas, or both. He's able to somehow ride the line between the material and the immaterial, between the spiritual and the atheistic in a strange way, always hovering around this question of the sexual relation and the Oedipal. So that even in his earliest works, like Eraserhead and Blue Velvet, they exist in the material world, but deal with the crisis of the relationship in Eraserhead, which breaks down and leads to his experience of the newborn, the shattering of the Oedipal complex, revisited in Blue Velvet soon after, where the kidnapped father is used to blackmail the mother into sexual prostitution, and that's finally order is partially restored. But then Lynch takes on a dive into the psychic dimension. This perhaps corresponded with his turn to meditation. Lynch says, I didn't turn to psychoanalysis, I turned to meditation. He also is known as a big proponent of meditation. And the idea that meditation isn't to make you healthy, cure you of your symptoms, and it won't ruin your art. In fact, for him, what he brings from his meditations and dreams, he actualizes, channels into his art. In another place, I said that what Lynch does is not to think first. First, he dreams, and then he constructs those dreams in his art and only thinks later. He learns, he thinks based on the construction of his dreams and whims. This is a model for analysis. It's a model for how we can live. So in the next phase, in Lost Highway and Mulholland Drive, he begins to introduce the other world of beings that circulate in and out of the trauma of the sexual relation. And finally begins to introduce more from the Vedic and Buddhist Bardo realms in subtle ways, both named and unnamed. So as a kind of a finishing process for the moment, what I wanted to do was to read something regarding Inland Empire, which is a kind of, it's David Lynch's final statement. Now 14 years old, he includes references to all his other films leading up to this point. He worked in a singular way, finally releasing himself from the compromises of the big other of Hollywood production. He filmed the whole film himself as cinematographer with a digital video camera, which was relatively inexpensive compared to the necessities of the past. He edited the film himself with help over a period of months and months. So every aspect he takes on at this point of director, writer, cinematographer, editor, assembling a work of art that sometimes looks like contemporary abstract video art, like Mike Kelly or Paul McCarthy. Other times, like old Hollywood. Film is a mass of complexities and wormholes of different realities. Now, I was already fascinated with David Lynch, and even Lost Highway and Mulholland Drive forced me to rewatch them over and over to try to decipher what was going on. I realized finally by Mulholland Drive that he was presenting a Bardo realm, a realm outside of the human, and the multiple human lives or worlds that are connected to that realm or that oversoul. And that way of reading David Lynch, whether or not you're familiar with Buddhist or Vedic ideas, I think is the only way to read Lynch at this point. Inland Empire takes this to another level of complexity. And as he says, he doesn't even have a script. In this case, he has a series of ideas and dreams that he constructs in process using the actors and the staff and the materials as assemblage points and materials to present and enact this semi-dream that he has. This work in process is a kind of surrealism. So I found a text the other day while I was thinking about preparing for this talk, and it is a lost text I wrote on Inland Empire 14 years ago or so. When the film came out, it didn't really come out. There was one copy of it, and David Lynch would tour with it. Well, not tour exactly, but present it for a short period in different towns and come and talk about it. I was fortunate enough to be able to see it a few times in different locations and try to make sense of it. I claimed at the time, after many watchings and thinking about it, I was the only person that understood what the film was about. I think that's partially true and partially still true. I don't think anyone knows what it's about, including Lynch, and he refuses to know what it's about completely anyway. But I have certain things to say about it that I think still haven't been said in public, even though a lot of the puzzles have been deciphered. And it refers so much to this question that you can see that even in the image for the film, the subtitle is "A Woman in Trouble." So this relates somewhat to a mythical trauma of Lynch's. Perhaps this trauma of Lynch's occupies a similar place to Boyce's mythos of being shot down in World War I. That Boyce was shot down and saved, rescued by Tibetan Buddhists, perhaps, covered with materials, fat and felt, nursed back to life. And that these materials and these shamanic esoteric processes of the ancient Bon shamanism of Tibet, syncretized with Buddhism, became a part of Boyce's work as performance art to transform and heal the planet. Similar to Lynch, he makes reference to an idyllic childhood of 40s, 50s, post-war era of the Oedipal family and the small town and the eruption of trauma into this perfect environment. It takes many forms, except that there are some stories of a disappearance of his mother for a period of time. Disappearance to New York from the small town, disappearance to find some man, some ex, some other. We don't know the whole story, but it seems that in his films, increasingly and finally in Inland Empire, he's working out this. It's at the level of an archetype for all of us. So I'm going to read this text, which perhaps is impossible to understand or indecipherable. I don't know, but I'm going to do it anyway to get it on record and see if it's something that can speak to what we've been talking about. Now, when Lynch came to speak about the film in New York to the audience, he said something that struck me. We are like the spider that weaves its life and moves in it, the dreamer who dreams and lives in the dream. And he did reference that this comes from the ancient Vedas, the Indian texts, which are some consider the oldest texts in the world. And they follow aspects of Vedanta and Veda Vedanta that influenced also Tibetan Buddhism and a lot of aspects that you see repeated in Lynch's work. So, the text of Inland Empire, A Woman in Trouble, begins like this. First section, titled Up in Heaven, Not Only Down Here. We could say, if we wished to follow certain leads in modern mathematics or Buddhist poetics or the Kabbalah, that being is infinite and void at the same time. That which expands infinitely is not anything at all. It is nothing. Yet we are here. How is it that we can distinguish this being here from being itself, or being as being? This localized being, or Dasein, as Heidegger called it, from being in its infinite and void nature, or Sein. Being here, what exists, partakes of a world, a locality, a topos. That is part of why I titled this talk, Inland Empire, the Topology of Existence. Topology is the logic of the local that modern mathematics has developed to answer certain impasses of the discrete and the binary, and that Lacan took up in trying to understand the psyche. Being here, or what exists, partakes of a world. It is a part of this infinite being. We could say it is a set of relations, temporarily, partially, or artificially removed from this infinite nothingness which presents itself or exists. It is a representation. According to a particular logic or code, a contingency, we ourselves are presented, and yet we don't even know it. We think we are infinite. It's not possible to think our own death. So is it possible that a presentation within a presentation could help us see? Is it possible that a construction, a writing, or an art could help us see the blind spot, the unconscious of our own limited, contingent, presented nature in the infinite? Is this what art is? Is it possible that a poetics, an artifice, can lead us to the artifice of the world we are in? Words, images, symbols, signs are so many elements of the creation of worlds. Cinema, painting, writing reveal even as they create, collapsing the dualism of invention and discovery. Between revelation and creation is manifestation. The 20th century was an unprecedented experiment in the deconstruction of worlds whose effects have not begun to be grasped. What crisis is emerging now? Nietzsche himself heralded the coming era. With the death of God, he said, the death of the transcendental signifier or guarantor of our world, the collapse of the other or the symbolic meaning, as I just referred to by Lacan's diagram. Where were we heading? Modernist abstraction and technological experimentation appear like a child whose drive outstrips any form of containment, so anxious to undo this world of boundaries and rules, this life of instrument. Does anyone yet know how to construct a world? As Philip Dick said, if you think this world is bad, you should see some of the other ones. Lacan called it upir, or worse, the patriarchal construction or the index, the name of the father. What if it's worse to deconstruct it without knowing what's on the other side? This is what Lacan pointed out. What lies beyond the disintegration of the symbolic order? But some have not shied away from this challenge, and that includes Lacan himself with his invention of the symptôme, its purification of enjoyment of the symptom. If this relentless deconstruction of modernity has revealed the void of being to us, then where do we go from here? Suspended over an abyss, Nietzsche said, I am a bridge. a bridge between worlds, an answer to nihilism. After the ontology of being, there could be a topology or phenomenology of existence. That would require the preservation and enjoyment of a multiplicity of worlds, as Nietzsche said. Now that the one truth over and over again has been deconstructed, history lies beyond us and behind us like a vast playground. On the other side of nihilism is the possibility of play and joy, but only with the responsibility to co-create it, to construct it ourselves. Nowhere is the logic of worlds explored more thoroughly than in the art of David Lynch. Lynch's worlds partake of sound, word, image, performance, music, and temporal unfolding of the cinematic. Inland Empire presents the extreme expression of Lynch's worlds. It is all his films combined and more. We will never be able to pin down the details of Inland Empire because its logic is not of this world. It is not Aristotelian dualistic logic. There is no excluded middle. Rules are broken constantly. There is no complementarity, no perfect fit. One of the secrets to Lynch's scrambled code is that actors do not stick to their characters. Thus, in order to decode the logic of Inland Empire, we need to grasp the inner structure and not the facts or externalities. Different actors play the same character. Different characters are part of one actor. And in this, Lynch repeats again and again, in this world, the sexual relation is impossible. Between man and woman, active and passive, sex and love, there is no perfect fit. Is this what drives this world? What provides its potency and potential? Does humanity on Earth have a built-in motor drive that requires no fuel? Is it this disjunction, this sexual non-relation that appears on all level, from the physical to the psychic to the spiritual? And the solution to this, as the band leader says in Mulholland Drive, is that there is no band, no musical band, and no band to contain and gather meaning, no symbolic. It is all illusion. And that elsewhere, in heaven, as the song goes in Eraserhead, everything is fine. Laura Palmer and Dale Cooper laughing in the analyst's red room at the end of Fire Walk with Me. So what is the structure of Inland Empire? 4 characters, 2 women and 2 men. A woman in trouble, seeking love and finding sex and manipulation by a man pimp who seeks to control her. So she finds a lover outside the contract of marriage, prostitution. But the lover has a wife whom the pimp can hypnotize into killing her fellow woman, even as he kills his fellow man. Jealousy, the green-eyed monster that mocks the meat it feeds upon, gets the better of most relationships. This 4 is only 2, for we destroy one another if we do not destroy each other. The mother and the whore, the father and the pimp. What are these structural archetypes that we continue to enact, thinking we are ourselves, something different? The world that is not a world in the film, World Zero, is the inner world that links the other worlds together. The Inland Empire of psychic dimensions of David Lynch's meditative experience. World 1 is the Inland Empire of the landlocked European Baltic region. World 2 is the Inland Empire of California, Pomona, Santa Ana County. World 3 is the Inland Empire of Los Angeles, Hollywood, and the cinematic illusion. World 4, which does not appear in the film, is the Inland Empire of David Lynch's childhood, Spokane, Washington, where Lynch grew up. The Midwest, the world in which the idea of this woman in trouble formed itself in his psyche. Next section, Inland Empire. What is the logic of the Inland Empire? Inland Empire is many things. First and foremost, it is that inner experience that one dives into during meditative states, including dreaming and creating, yoga and psychoanalysis. Lynch is a well-known practitioner and proponent of meditation. Far from taking away from artistic expression, diving in, quote, to the Inland Empire only increases creative potential. In the film, the Inland Empire forms the tunnels and gateways between worlds. This Inland Empire is the inner experience, the in-between zone, the liminal. And so at once we are introduced to the spatio-temporal paradoxes of Lynch's worlds, where the most outer is the most inner. The outer zones up there are actually deep in the core, down inside. An example of Lacan's extimacy pun, where the most intimate is the most extimate, and vice versa. Let world zero equal this world of the inner core. In this inner core exists, as I will call them, the magicians, the rabbits, and the psychoanalyst. This is demonstrated when a rabbit exits the door of his room, only to appear as a flat image in another room in which a magician manifests. And again, when three magicians performing a seance ritual slowly position themselves into a ritual placement and transform into three rabbits in their room. Always in Lynch's films, there are these in-between worlds in which characters seem to be arranging, affecting, and assisting those in the other worlds. Those, quote, humans down below, Bob, the dwarf, and the one-armed man in Fire Walk With Me, the mystery man or cell phone man in Lost Highway, the homeless man monster behind the wimpies in the alleyways of Hollywood and Mulholland Drive, in Mulholland Drive. They inhabit these liminal zones where humans can travel between worlds. The Red Room, the prison cell of Lost Highway, the parking lot of Mulholland Drive, the Red Room of Twin Peaks, and the endless halls and corridors between suburban homes, stage sets, and theaters in Inland Empire. Next section, World 1, the Baltic region. A gray winter's day in the old hotel, it says, an old Polish folktale, a man and a woman. Are they married? She seeks a man who teaches her sex. It's an old story. It ends the same. They show you what they are made of. She seeks love and finds sex, jealousy, and control. She seeks a lover instead. They meet in the streets. This time she meets her husband, quote, by accident. The pimp, he says, I didn't recognize you, outside the house. Does a man recognize his woman other than as his object, wife? Does a man ever recognize a woman only in the streets where she is not yet his? He tells her, someone was murdered over there in the streets. I think you know him. Her lover is murdered at 9:45, and so she has to take to the streets now, a whore for real. She finds her place in the company of women. To the two girls, the twins, quote, she says, do you recognize me? Can a woman be recognized by another woman? Look at me, quote, and tell me if you have seen me before. You do not see her death, only the in-between world, a hotel room, a waiting room, a purgatory, a bardo, an island between. Watching the story of her life before her, but she asks herself, her double, do you want to see? She watches the video in her room. She looks through the hole in the silk and she sees. She walks through the doorway in the alley and she sees. World 2, next section, Pomona. Quote, I thought he was the one. Go find someone else. It's not easy when you feel like shit. This is what the girls say to each other. The Inland Empire of Santa Ana County is a real estate concept. California is the Golden State, but who wants to live in the desert of the Inland Empire? In a sense, the whole of America between California and New York is the Inland Empire, a vast wasteland of cultural ignorance. Ha! The house in Pomona is the most volatile of worlds in Lynch's films. It seems to mutate from vintage splendor to dingy hovel. But the backyard especially tells the story. White trash. In this world, the lover is not seen. The husband is Polish and eventually returns to the Baltic region with a strange carnival led by the phantom magician. She is pregnant. He cannot father children. The lover is inferred. He is not present. Afterwards, she is in the company of women, whores. It is here where we learn the secrets of women. Women are a mass. The woman does not exist. Women are their mothers until or unless they are separated by some man. At least that's the story here. The impasse of the sexual relation that Lacan tried to resolve and that Lynch tries to resolve. What would be the alternate feminine? Is it answered here? The father, the husband, the pimp, the John, the lover. While they stick together like a horde, walking the street or dancing or sharing their suffering, these women also turn against each other, stabbing their own. Traveling from Pomona or to Hollywood Boulevard, you too can find a man, become a star, or die on the street of a broken dream. You cannot escape your destiny. On the streets, afraid she is being stalked, she runs into a club. I know Carolina, she speaks the name of her Polish self, her Polish alternate. She is led upstairs to the, quote, psychoanalyst to tell her story. Halfway through, she leaves and finds herself back on the streets. I'm not going, she says, perhaps. Yet she is stabbed by her own screwdriver in a strange Mobius strip of two emanations of the same subject, the same female or feminine subject, falling to die amongst the homeless saints who tell her story in another version and prepare her for death, just as the Tibetan Buddhists do to enter the inland empire of the Bardo realms. Quote, I see the light. You're on high now. No more blue tomorrows. But this Nikki gets up from her scene and walks in a daze to the stage set, back into the comforts, back into the corridors and tunnels, up to the analyst's office once again, this time where she will tell her story where she left off. There is no avoiding your destiny, but this time the story will be completed just after midnight. Next section, World 3, Hollywood. Now in Hollywood, in another house, interior, a Polish neighbor comes to tell Nikki, the actress, the story of her story. A Polish folktale, she calls it. Quote, I suppose if it were 9:45, you would think it was just after midnight. At 9:45, he dies, just like in the Polish version of her life. Just after midnight, she kills him and he returns, as in the Pomona story. But not yet. First, there's the part, and then there's the story within the story bleeding through. Nikki, in bed with Devon, the actors, also their characters, Billy, in bed with Sue. Quote, Devon, it's me, Nikki. In bed is the memory of the moment of transition in the alley that leads to the inland empire, the primal scene. It's the script within the script, the story within the story that leads to memory, that triggers memory. Just like the moment in Mulholland Drive, when the beautiful dreamed Bardo story of the first half of the film, where the females are friends and love each other and finally try to have sex, triggers the traumatic memory of the fact that in another life, they became bitter enemies and one murdered the other and then murdered herself. The primal trauma that triggers a remembering. Devin, it's me, Nikki. In bed is the memory of the moment of transition in the alley that leads to the Inland Empire. It's the script within the script, the story within the story that leads to memory. Do you want to see? Anamnesis, the Greek calls it. The unforgetting, the remembering. Nikki, the actor, Sue, the character, Pomona, housewife, whore, and the Polish Karolina are all the women of the structure. She and her lover are murdered once again by the husband, pimp, and the story repeats endlessly through many worlds and many lifetimes. Next section, World 4, Spokane, Washington, David Lynch's childhood. What happened in Lynch's world? Some have speculated on his biography, but what exists is in the films. As the replicant in Blade Runner says, "Let me tell you about my mother." The cinematic symptom is the analysis of the symptom. In Lynch's world, everything is resolved. The ending is both happy and unhappy. There is death, but there is transcendence. In Blue Velvet, Donnie dies, but his wife and child play on the lawn. In Fire Walk with Me, Laura dies, but laughs with Dale in another dimension. In Mulholland Drive, Betty dies, but dances above as a star. Strangely, Lost Highway represents a momentary departure into dark territory, presenting a Mobius strip in which there is no outside, only an endless loop of repetition, where the end of the film appears at the beginning. Finally, in Inland Empire, the character has a chance to confront the destiny of her psychic structure. It incorporates the happy endings in the heaven of the previous films and the karmic repetition of Lost Highway, not to mention the surrealist, absurdist ending of Eraserhead. Quote, "In heaven, everything is fine. You've got your good things and I've got mine." This time, the repetition is not the prison of exact exchange, but variations of difference that tear an opening into the closure of a world and finally reveal the core behind the Maya or illusion of reality. Philip Dick's Groove Override, in which the cycle of repetition and programming is escaped by a human or a replicant AI, is pictorially represented in Inland Empire by the movement from turn-of-the-century vinyl album recording at the beginning of the film to the immediacy of turn-of-the-millennium digital video rewrites, where the film is not even loaded and checked. Rather than the vicious circle, we have the eternal recurrence of the creating and voiding of worlds, manifestation. Nietzsche's Übermensch is not the Superman, but the Overman, who emerges to participate in this manifestation as the autopoetic co-creator of his own world. As the Overman, one no longer lives as victim or result of one's circumstances down below. One becomes the cause, seeing from above and inventing the imperative or contingency, retroactively and forwardly embracing responsibility for one's actions and results, the true meaning of karma. World Zero. The inner world is inhabited by many beings, such as rabbits. Quote, they say, "I am going to find out one day. It won't be long now. What time is it?" Ha ha ha, laugh track. Why is it funny? Because there is no time in the Inland Empire. This scene seems to allude to a Fire Walk with Me scenario of father-daughter eros. Together on the couch with the mother, ignorant, doing housework. To find out is to see, like Laura Palmer finally seeing that Bob is her father who has her. But the bunnies, the rabbits, are always accompanied by the sound of a train showing their link to Pomona. The cigarette burn through the silk underwear of Pomona that shows up in the rabbit's world that lets her see. It penetrates to the sound of fire. Fire walk with me. But the rabbits become the magicians who have a particular connection to the Baltic world. The husband tells the magician he is looking for an opening to control this woman throughout other worlds. the lover enters the seance with the same magicians to find his woman. The same magicians that give the phantom an opening give him a gun. In the Inland Empire, there is no allegiance, just as when the mystery man who helps Mr. Eddie in Lost Highway provides the gun that ends up killing him. The logic of worlds is an illusion which plays itself out, a game that unfolds. The dice are rolled and the story is revealed. When you die, it is said that your whole life flashes before you. Carolina watches the video of her life while Nikki tells her story to the analyst in the room at the end of the hall at the top of the stairs. There is a room, a hotel room, a bedroom where lovers go. Here things are done in the flesh and stories are told undercover, and another watches. There is a witness. The husband, now played by the same actor who once played the lover, watches. In the end, the story will be complete. The lover has placed the gun he received from the magicians so that his woman will find it and kill him. Kill the part of him which is the husband, the controller, the pimp. In the corridors near room 47, he is killed for good. Then she finds herself, Nikki, wandering through the labyrinths of the inner world, finally to enter Carolina's room. They embrace in the room, the scene mirrored and duplicated endlessly on the video monitor reflecting screen, while the two selves merge. They embrace in her room, the scene mirrors. They embrace on the video monitor reflecting screen while the two selves merge. Then Carolina rushes to the door of another room to find a knocking. Her lover and child restored at last. Oedipus wrecked and resolved. While back in the mansion, all of the, quote, extras live happily ever after, famous and rich and illusory in Hollywood. Well, I didn't expect it to be so long, but it's finished now. I have nothing else to say. Hopefully, people have comments they want to make. I believe down at the bottom, you can click raise your hand and we can enable the audio if someone has any comments on anything. This long-winded, complex analysis of the insane Inland Empire, or the insane symptom of Lacan and Freud psychoanalysis, or perhaps all the way back to how we could apply some of this to the situation, any situation of today, of the sexual non-relationship, if that makes any sense. So maybe we need a breather for a minute, but if you would like to type a comment, I will now look over the Q&A and see what I see. So feel free to make a comment on the Q&A or put a question down there, or to raise your hand if you can figure that out. A question. Okay. What is really meant by the term symptom in psychoanalysis? Let's say if we can see how this leads us into the particular aspect of the sexual relationship. Okay, while I'm speaking, like I said, feel free to write another question or to raise your hand and speak up. You can just speak if you want and stay invisible. You don't have to appear, since we're doing this as radio. In the future, I will stop speaking for 1 to 2 hours and have perhaps whole events where I just ask for questions or comments about anything. How about a story? Isn't it possible that we can turn this into Delilah and play a dedication song regarding a broken love affair? I would like to get to that place somehow, or even better, I would like to somehow link this insane art and clinic to the simplicity of Delilah's stories. But for the moment, symptom. Well, let's take a look at the etymology, the philology of the word. Symptom, the Greek has the PTO, pito, which is in ptosis. It means to fall away. So the term symptom goes back to the Greeks, like a lot of analysis goes back to the Greeks, or all of analysis, as a philosophical practice. The symptom was considered a deviation, mathematically, scientifically, culturally. So then over time in medicine, the symptom is considered a deviation from the norm, or whatever is supposed to be normally healthy. So we still consider it that. In medicine, we distinguish between symptoms and signs. A sign is anything that, let's say, I as a doctor could observe in someone that person might not be aware of. It's me seeing things on an objective level. A symptom is a reported subjective experience by a patient. These are different. They're both useful. Objectification and subjectification. So in a sense, you could say that psychoanalysis raises the level of the symptom to the highest level, the subjective experience of the person or the patient. So psychiatry works primarily with signs, or it turns all symptoms into signs, in that it's going to be described from the outside as a form of not universal singularity, but a general, turning particular symptoms into a generality. Psychoanalysis aims to be an art and a practice and a clinic of the inner subjective experience. That is, to emphasize the question of the symptom. Now, even in medicine, a pain is never a sign. It's not objective. Pain is a subjectively reported experience by someone that refers to something objective. That pain can refer to a broken leg. It could refer to a pulled muscle. It could refer to an organic problem, problem with the stomach relating to a behavior of eating. It can refer to something subjective, purely psychic, a relationship broken, a loss, as example. So far, this is what is meant by the symptom in psychoanalysis. And then I think we can take it to an even further level and say, can we get beyond the presenting symptom? Can we figure out what the more general symptoms of our life are? This might resonate with the idea of a repeated pattern that was programmed in us by our experience in childhood. This could be referred to in the spiritual traditions as a karma, a karmic pattern, a leftover symptom that's unresolved from lifetime to lifetime, like in the David Lynch films. The question of the sexual non-relationship is repeated in multiple lifetimes, shown and staged in Inland Empire. And the particulars of this woman being, this oversoul that's reincarnated, or that simply it's different stories of different women in different places that can be seen as a similar archetype or pattern that we might resolve, that we all go through. So this turns the symptom into an art. It turns it into the idea of trying to discover this essence or this repetition. And finally, the inversion of the term symptom to symptome, which Lacan spelled Sinthome, an ancient medieval spelling, was meant to reflect a work on the symptom directly, to refine it and transform it, to make it work for you in a sense, to make it, as Lacan said, a savoir-faire, a know-how, a pragmatism about how to do something with one symptom. If we're born with symptoms, if we're all born with a symptom, if it's our karmic lot, or if it's something we want to learn, or if it's an inevitable trauma or failure or splitting of our being human, then the best we can do is to make some use of it, to turn it into something useful and or enjoyable. Here's the psychoanalytic ethic or method, at least the one that's refined through Lacan and some others into our approach at Analytica, not necessarily the way it is in all psychoanalysts, but what then is the symptom, is the work of the construction of this, not the passive acceptance. It first requires the passive acceptance. It requires one to see, to quote, see, as it says in Inland Empire. Can you see? First, you have to remember. Psychoanalysis is a practice of anamnesis, like the Greeks, to recall what one forgot that happened. It's 3 stages. To unforget what was repressed. The revelation is seeing in oneself, one's subjectivity, one's history, one's actions. Only then is it possible to actually get hold of it and construct it as something different. So it requires the pain of witnessing in order to reconstruct it as something else. This is a further idea of the symptom into symptome. Also, the symptome spelling contains not the idea of a dropping or falling or a deviation, but the idea of a synthesis. The idea of a synthesis of what was once a sin, perhaps, also. Sin, similar to ptosis, denoting deviation or the left-handed path, as in sinister or sin. But finally, a synthesis in the symptome, or as Lacan often puns, the symptome is Saint Man or Saint Tom, Saint Thomas Aquinas, who offered a certain esoteric path towards taking the contingency of one's being and relating it to the universal. This new approach to Christ that Saint Thomas brought out, away from the scholasticism and destructive hierarchy of the dark ages of the church, is an opening that Lacan sees from that point into the present, all the way from St. Thomas, the mystic, to James Joyce, the mystic, with his epiphanies in his writings, and by way of Saint Teresa and other mystics, saints of the feminine. So finally, these works of Lynch work specifically on this symptom, the non-relation, and as David Lynch reveals in the subtitle, A Woman in Trouble is a symptom that he works throughout his whole life and work, and therefore is very useful in this regard. Other thoughts, questions, comments? Okay. Very nice questions here. Okay, now we're getting a lot. There's the question of what is contingency, like the symptom. There is the question of the relationship of the sexual trauma and non-relationship to the spirit, God, and the question of Eastern versus Western mysticism. In recent times, people have brought out texts to show that the idea of the oversoul or the multiple incarnations was part of the Western tradition as well, that was suppressed, whereas it wasn't in the East. So a lot of times what appears different in Eastern and Western esoteric traditions can be brought together in some way. There's differences and similarities in terms of the idea of contingency. I've spoken of, let's see, some of what I talked about today refers to a tradition in philosophy. I referenced Heidegger's idea, existential philosophy, that existence is different from being, that while being is infinite, and it's something that philosophy in the West has investigated, as well as the spiritual traditions of the East, the Vedas, etc. Heidegger's idea of being as infinite and void is very similar to the Eastern spiritual traditions. Heidegger also adds the other component of the being there, the localization, the topos, the local world of being. Hence this idea that frames my text on Inland Empire as a logic of multiple worlds. That can be applied to our everyday life as atheists, just as easily as it can be applied to an idea of multiple lifetimes in the Eastern sense, or the spiritual sense of reincarnation, or just as easily as it could be related to cultural constructions or modes of beings. Someone asked, what are my thoughts on Deleuze? Well, I haven't mentioned Deleuze and Guattari, but in fact, they've influenced my work as much or more than anyone. And they're the only ones, they're the only of Lacan's pupils and Alazan's followers to really grasp, I think, the late Lacan and innovate the work in this direction. Their whole work, from Anti-Oedipus and 1,000 Plateaus onward, is an attempt to extend analysis into this construction of worlds. Schizoanalysis for Deleuze and Guattari is taking analysis out of the one-on-one, which is essential, into larger territories of groups, collectives, technologies, physical environments, how to spread and distribute the analytic into the world at large. And their solution also is very similar. If Anti-Oedipus is a clearing away of the failures of the old Oedipus, and Deleuze and Guattari's solution to it is not all that different from Lacan's, even though they would arrive at it separately at different times. And more importantly, that clearing away of Anti-Oedipus, which is volume 1 of Schizophrenia, Capitalism and Schizophrenia, gives rise to the second volume of Capitalism and Schizophrenia called 1,000 Plateaus. The idea of the 1,000 Plateaus could just as easily be considered the multiple worlds with their local logics. In that text, they show how to construct multiple worlds and use different space and time and historical examples of that. So it becomes a kind of toolkit on construction of worlds. So if anyone's looking for the answer or more practical, even though seemingly complex advice on how to move forward with the future of analysis and the resolution of the sexual non-relation and the resolution of the impasse of the Oedipus family complex, I would say to read and reread Deleuze and Guattari's Capitalism and Schizophrenia, volume 1 and 2. It's still a manual for the future and ahead of its time, and hasn't really been understood fully in its import. So in terms of the sexual relation, I wanted to refer this back to, before I move on to that, just to relate the question of contingency to that. What's accepted after Lacan demonstrates it clinically as the collapse of the big other, collapse of symbolic meaning, is that all symbolic meaning, one's own personal history and or the things one has come to believe, is a contingency, and that is necessary to be able to work with that, and say that even though it's not the truth, it's a truth for me, and I live it and I believe in it, and I attempt to live it amongst other truths. This is difficult, obviously, at this time where we're still more than ever fighting over the one truth and living in ridiculous binaries of sexual identities or racial identities or political parties, instead of the possibility of multiplicity and diversity that was opened up in the 20th century, and perhaps a high point in the 60s and 70s that we regressed away from and live in a kind of pathetic state compared to 50 years ago. So I highly recommend going back to the texts of these great modernists from the 20th century up into the 60s and 70s. A little book was written recently that was part of this philosophical lineage called The Necessity of Contingency, which gives a good logical proof that the only necessity in the universe is contingency. I counter this with the idea that contingency may not be a necessity in itself. It may be that there are no necessities, not even contingency, except to the degree that if contingency is a necessity, it's not contingency in the random sense or the chaotic sense. It's what I call the necessity of contingency on another level, the stress not being on contingency, but on necessity, meaning in the face of seeing that everything is contingent, in order to avoid nihilism and chaos, it is necessary at that point for each subject to find and or create and construct a contingency for himself, which is necessary. And this is another name for the symptom for Lacan. And the idea that within what we think is our worst symptom, we will discover this most important necessity of the truth of our being and turn it into a work of art or a work of functional practicality, or both in some way. This is the greater aim that analysis has, hopefully, at least for me in Analytica and some others. Finally, although I'm still waiting for other questions, either live or on the Q&A, I'll make a little return of this to the question of the sexual again, and say that one thing that I discovered, or something a little bit new, just in going over this in recent days, which I haven't even begun to fully make sense of, is this idea of the relation among syntomes beyond the sexual relation. If Lacan says either that this is an achievement or that it is a happening, the end of the old sexual relation, what comes next? Meaning, if Lacan says that in recent times the sexual relation has held together human reality and culture based on the woman as a symptom of the man, both for men and women, and that's over, what comes after? And he poses this idea of discovering one's symptom, refining one's symptom, identifying with one's symptom, perfecting one's symptom. But what is the relation among symptoms? What does that mean for partnerships, families, culture? And that's not answerable. This is what we have to answer after Lacan. I say that Deleuze and Guattari give some picture of how that might look, immersed as they were in all of the happenings of the 60s and 70s. But we've barely answered this and haven't resolved it. So we have to see what this looks like. I am saying, based on these cases of distinguishing the so-called successful symptom from the unsuccessful symptom, that it has something to do with a relation to one's work and a relation to one's object desire and a relation to one's identity, all as symptom, meaning that the symptom becomes constructed as a kind of work of writing or painting or cooking or building or raising children or whatever it is. It becomes a work, and it becomes an identity that one is that thing. One is the symptom. One identifies with the symptom, and one practices the symptom. And finally, one relates to another symptom, meaning it requires at least another partner, and or perhaps, if better, many partners or friends or lovers as symptoms. So this is the thing that's newly coming to the forefront for me. And I guess I can say as emergent as a possible new discovery or solution for me, at least at this moment of giving this, which is part of why I do this, to discover something new in my presentation and offering to others, and what I hear and what they hear from me being in the position of analysand as speaking, or the position of analysand become analyst as advocate, meaning I speak for my desire from this position of my symptom. I try to refine my symptom into this place that I'm speaking. And this is what I'm hearing new today, which is that the symptom has a tripartite nature, at least, which has never been said in psychoanalysis or even by any Lacanians or Lacan himself. But that it appears to me that the symptom as symptom, the refined symptom or symptom, is both an identity, a practice, and a relation to the other, an object desire. So that it finally brings together all of these separate aspects of the sexual relation and the Oedipus complex. It also brings together the essence of, in such a simple way, what Reich said was the essence of human happiness. That is, to be happy in one's work and one's relationship. It may seem simple. The difference being that it all comes from the symptom and the singularity. And that is the one thing that we still do not allow of one another at all, because of the desperation by which we try to prop up our symbolic truth over our neighbors, being willing to shut them up and or kill them before being able to experience the multiplicity, the contingency of our various symptoms and desires. As an addendum to a future aspect of this, I will say that although it is difficult, I'm going to attempt to speak less and less and listen more and more in these events. The purpose of the seminars for the members of Analytic is to present this material and to go over it. And I've presented a lot of it in recent weeks for the public. It brings in people of new interest. I think people should be exposed to it. But if people think it's gibberish and tune out, that's fine too. But what I really aim at in the public events is to begin to open them up to listening and dialogue. And I can see that presentation of this material does not afford that. So, as I said, over the next weeks and months, I will be transitioning, presenting similar material, but with less and less complexity and less speech, and more participation and call in from the audience, with the aim of even moving it towards something more like a talk radio or a call-in radio. And myself, as I tried to do with the Inland Empire text, to do it more as a performance, more as sonic art than presented webinar. But in any case, in terms of the upcoming topics, well, if you're interested in this more complex material and want to attend as a member or as not a member, and you can go onto the website and find out how to. I will present in the Lacan seminars the completion of the diagrams of sexuation, where to go and how to resolve these questions for oneself on gender, identity, sexual object choice, biological sex, and all the other variables involved in this complex circuit. It's not a simple binary. I will also present over a series of steps and diagrams what I call the resolution of the Oedipus complex that I've come up with through the work of Freud, Reich, Jung, and Lacan, and how this relates to the Oedipus complex of childhood formation and the impasses of marriage and parenthood today. Finally, in terms of the subjects of the upcoming public seminars, as I call it, the radiophone or radiophony, some of the topics will include the impossible, love and the poetics of alchemy, love beyond the grave, the end of sex, which is not the same as the end of the sexual relationship, and the question of the anima of animus, which is touched on in what I just said, to try to bring Jung back into it, this aspect of the feminine in the masculine and the masculine in the feminine as an esoteric process. And not only through reference to the spiritual or alchemical, but again, to modern artists. This time I'll take up the discourse of the feminine, as I call it, not the majority of discourse of the feminine or feminism today, which is a different way of taking over the phallus, essentially a matriarchal discourse or eonic approach as opposed to the patriarchal. And we keep shifting back and forth. I guess what I would say is that historically it is thought that the matriarchal discourse or eon of prehistory was replaced by the patriarchal eon or discourse of history and time and logic some thousands of years ago, and has dominated our culture until recently, maybe in modernity or from enlightenment to modernity, as referring to an eon of the individuated has been strong, while certainly not being completely dominant over the patriarchal culture, and hasn't really got enough foothold. Modernity, modernism, science, reason, modern art. This is part of the Aeon of the Sun. And we've heard even less from the discourse or Aeon of the Daughter, which is what I consider the true feminine. And I referenced, you could look, for example, at the work of Joni Mitchell, Marguerite Duras, or Kathy Acker to find an exposition of this, I believe. So I will spend a future radio show talking about this discourse of the feminine. Look at the comments one more time. Okay. Well, I think that's probably a good place to stop. Thank you all for joining. All right. Thanks.